It is now time to look at the Anglo-American Crisis. This is the conflict between the American colonists, the 13 colonies that we've been talking about, and the mother country, Great Britain. And it started in roughly 1765, and the political part of the conflict, which is what we'll be dealing with in this unit, lasted for 10 years before a war began, the War for American Independence, or the American Revolution, which eventually secured independence. So in this unit, we look at the political part of the discrepancies between the two sides, the British on one side, their colonists on the other side of the Atlantic. And in the next unit, we look at the situation, the crisis becoming even more extreme in an all-out bloody 7-year war that eventually secured American independence and the creation of the United States. We're starting to get to events, and names, and things in this class that you'll become increasingly more familiar with. That'll be even more true in the next unit and the one after that. We're already getting to some famous stuff here. So before we go further, I want to ask a question and sort of lay some of the groundwork and again add some context, which always helps. I ask the question on the outline: was the whole crisis an American overreaction? The Boston Tea Party you see pictured here on the screen, and other such famous acts, and some less famous. And I would argue that yes, it was an overreaction, but we have to qualify that statement. I'm not saying that the colonists didn't have legitimate grievances against British policy, laws, taxation. I believe they did, but the American colonists in time, actually pretty quickly, came to see the whole crisis as a conspiracy, meaning it was well planned out and long ago planned out by the British government to deprive Americans of their liberties, rights, and freedoms. I don't think there's any evidence that that is the case. So even though what the British did, we could argue, was wrong, was an unfair, unjust to the colonists, it wasn't a pre-planned out, well thought out campaign to try to deprive the colonists of their rights. The British imposed taxes and laws for what they thought were practical, legitimate purposes that they miscalculated, for sure, the colonial response, but it doesn't seem to have been a plot to destroy American liberty. And we have to say that because there's a tendency, I think, to believe that even today. Also, as part of the introduction and establishing some context, we must know and understand that this crisis took a long time to unfold. Right? It starts in roughly 1765 and lasts until 1775 before the war begins. So that's 10 years of rancorous political back and forth and very angry conflict on both sides. But the question is, why did it take 10 years to lead to war, given that both sides were so hot, especially the colonists at first, and eventually both sides increasingly coming to take this crisis emotionally? Well, there's a number of things that can be pointed out here. That first of all, the American colonists, we think of, from our perspective today, as Americans. But if we really want to get to the truth, and we do, we have to recognize that through the 18th century, and we just did a whole unit on some of the bigger picture trends and underlying forces and currents in the 18th century, which adds context to this as well. We have to add on to all of that an understanding that almost all of the colonists saw themselves as loyal British citizens. Right up until the conflict in 1765 began, they didn't think of themselves as Americans. They thought of themselves as loyal British citizens. They were proud to be members of the British Empire and citizens of that country. It's not even until just a number of years before the crisis and the American Revolution that you even see the word American in the primary source documents. And if you don't see the word, and there's plenty of documents that we have from this time period, it's pretty clear that that means that there was no such word because there was no concept American. The English colonists thought of themselves as English, just English people living on, or British citizens living on this side of the Atlantic, and they saw the British in England and Great Britain as British citizens living on that side of the Atlantic. So these were proud British citizens, which helps us to explain why this conflict, again, which was emotional and quite bitter from the very beginning, took 10 years to lead to an all-out shooting war between the two sides. Also, a separate but related overlapping point is that before the word American comes into usage, it was harder for the colonists to see themselves as being able to oppose the British, at least in an outright sense, not just complaining, but actually, going to the point of war or desiring a permanent separation. Because when they still thought of themselves as British citizens, and proudly so, it was more as if, okay, we're English citizens on British citizens on this side of the Atlantic, they're British citizens on that side of the Atlantic, but that's still kind of a we versus we. And a we versus we situation could lead to a bitter conflict, could lead to war, but not as likely as when you start to think of, one side starts to think of itself as different. So once the word American comes around, now the thinking is not, it's we versus sort of the other group of we, it's us versus them. The Americans over here versus the British over there. And that was a long time in coming because of the proud, citizenship rights and just the thinking of the colonists for so long in taking such pride in British citizenship. And finally, in this regard, think to yourself what it would take. And I don't even want to know the answer to this, it's a rhetorical question, but what it would take for you to be so angry at your country now, right here in 2018 in the US, that you would not only contemplate, but actually follow through and carry out actions opposed to your government that extended to the degree of grabbing weapons, plotting against the government, trying to overthrow the government, trying to fight a war, by shooting at government soldiers and establishing an army that fought the U.S. government. Imagine what kind of psychological barriers there must have been to doing that. This is a long way to go psychologically. So no wonder it took 10 years, even though the colonists were irate from the Stamp Act crisis of 1765 on, at what the British were doing in terms of policy, taxation, and law that was coming down on the head of the American colonies. That's a big psychological move from loyal British citizen to, we're going to now pick up guns and fight against the British, kill British soldiers in order to secure independence in our own country. So this didn't come easily, and it took a long period of time, understandably. So the Anglo-American Crisis, the first 10 years, is a conflict, a political conflict that's maybe gradually leading to war, but nobody in 1765, and even for years afterwards, saw this as necessarily or wanted it to lead to a war. It happened that way. We also tend to see things from the American perspective as Americans. It's natural to do so. But in history, it always helps to try to put ourselves in other people's shoes. So if we look at this from the British perspective, the Americans just look like traitors. And actually, from the legal perspective of the time, they were traitors. As British citizens, they were subject to British law, and rising up against your own country is treason, and by legal definition. And in those days, the punishment for treason was death. So what would have happened to Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the like of the, our founding fathers, had we lost the American Revolution, they surely would have been hung. The penalty was death. So these guys would have been hung as traitors had they lost. Another way, I think, to get a grasp on how serious these events were, how big a series of psychological changes were required for the colonists to oppose Great Britain, and increasingly so, and eventually taking it to such extremes that they went to war to secure independence and fought a 7-year, as I said before, very bloody conflict. So we start by looking at some of the long-term factors that made war a possibility. At least we can see this in retrospect. It may not have been, of course, clear at the time. In some places it, of course, couldn't have been clear at the time. So some of these things are causes of the American Revolution, but they're more likely factors that help to prepare colonists unwittingly, psychologically, culturally, for a possible conflict with Great Britain. Nobody saw, for instance, the French and Indian War, which was a number of years before the crisis breaking out, as a potential cause of conflict or even setting the foundations for conflict, because they didn't know there was going to be a conflict. Nonetheless, with the advantage of hindsight, we can see that this was a factor, in this sense, a cause. So I'll just pick out 3 of the long-term factors that made war a possibility. We could talk about others. The first one you see here, the French and Indian War between 1756 and 1763. This was overall a global conflict between Great Britain and France, arguably the 2 most powerful countries in the world at the time. The global part of the war, which is fought on 3 continents, North America, Europe, and India, is often referred to as the 7 Years' War. So it's kind of a war with 2 names. The part that took place in the Americas that the colonists were involved in is the French and Indian War. And even that title is bound to, I think, confuse and mislead students, because it wasn't the French versus the Indians. It was a number of Indian Native American tribes allying with the French and fighting the British and her North American colonists we've been talking about now for some time. And in fact, some Native American groups stayed neutral, and a few even fought on the American side. So French and Indian War is actually an unfortunate title because it's quite misleading. But it's not uncommon in history for one war to help set the groundwork, the stage for another following war. A good example of this would be the First World War and the Second World War. All historians will tell you correctly that you can't really understand how and why World War II came about without making reference to what happened during and after World War I. So that's not uncommon, but in this case it's a little bit strange. Maybe you already see it, but what's odd is that we're saying that this war, the French and Indian War, helped to set up or lay the foundations, make a following war between Britain and her American colonists more likely. But in this earlier war, the British and her colonists in America were allies. So how could it be that allies in one war, the alliance between them is a possible partial explanation for a war between them later on? Obviously, as it says on the screen, there must have been friction between the British and the colonists, even though they were allies during the war and after the war. And we'll see this kind of bad blood was there at the time and afterwards, and we'll look at least a few of the reasons why. What happened to cause bad blood, even though they were on the same side in this war. So this also isn't totally uncommon in history. I take World War II again as an example. The Americans and the British later, oddly enough, were allies against Hitler and the Nazis. but not always easy allies. They made things work in the end, but there was a lot of squabbling back and forth and sometimes animosity between the two sides, even though they were fighting for the same cause against Nazi Germany. The bad blood didn't carry over like it did here earlier in history. So what was the friction? What caused the bad blood between these two allies fighting against the French? One example of this was the fact that a number of colonial merchants, some rich businessmen, continued to trade with the French well after the war was underway. And I think you can see how that would anger the British government and British policymakers in London when they were sending troops to help to defend the colonies against French encroachment. We'll talk about that in a bit. So from the British point of view, wait a minute, some of your merchants are doing business deals and trading with the enemy when we're sending troops over there to help you fight against them. And merchants, businessmen being who they are, they were apt to say what businessmen always do, and as well, we're just here to do business. We're to make a profit. We don't ask who our customers are. We don't ask them what they're doing with the goods. We just sell to stay in business. And to some degree, they may have had to compete to keep their business afloat. If somebody else is trading with the French and you don't, maybe you're at a disadvantage. Nonetheless, we can see how this would anger the British, and it certainly did. On the other side, the British government established some high-handed policies during the war without asking the colonists, and this was a source of great anger on the part of the colonists. There was mandatory billeting of British troops, which meant that British officers could bring their troops unannounced into any colonial town. This was a policy coming out of the British Parliament, and just demand that the colonists in that town or city put up, that's what billeting means, house British troops temporarily while they're there and feed and clothe and house them. British officers could come in then and say, okay, we're going to send 5 of our soldiers into this house, and 3 are going to stay at this house for 2 days, and 4 more at that house, and we need a wagon, so we're going to commandeer one family's wagon. We need 5 more horses that were killed in a battle or died, so we're going to take this farmer's horses without asking them. They're demanding it. They're telling them. And this was bound to go over poorly since the colonists were used to making those kind of decisions themselves. They were not used to somebody else coming in and telling them who's going to stay at their house and what things that they're going to need, and just take them from them. So this is a source of huge controversy. And I think one way to look at this is to picture one of the Virginia grandees, one of the big plantation owners, rich, powerful guy, maybe sits in the House of Burgesses, since we already talked about such people. These gentry, rich types with huge tobacco plantations and estates, and they don't take this well when somebody comes into one of their towns and British officer telling them what they're going to do and essentially taking control of their town, however temporarily. In a related issue that caused long-term anger and bad blood, British officers outranked their colonial counterparts at really every level. At least that was the idea. So the British government, also in high-handed fashion, told American colonial officers that any British officer of whatever rank outranked any colonial officer. So this would mean that, at least theoretically, and it happened at times, a 28-year-old British captain could come in, and maybe he was coming into a town to billet troops, he just said, so these issues overlap, could order around a, say, 54-year-old general in the Virginia or Pennsylvania militia. Remember, the colonists are putting up troops, their militias are fighting alongside British regular soldiers because they're on the same side in the war against the French. But this is also, I think, was destined to cause conflict, because the 54-year-old general thinks of the 28-year-old British captain as not only of a lower rank, but as like a kid by comparison. It's like, how dare this young punk come in here and tell me what to do? On the other side, the 28-year-old British captain, and I'm speaking hypothetically, but these things did happen, the British captain was equally appalled and couldn't believe that he got any kind of pushback at all from the 54-year-old guy. That actually is harder for us to understand. But remember, you didn't become a British officer unless you came from a wealthy, high-ranking family. So maybe even a member of the nobility. So this British captain, when he gets a 54-year-old colonial general, Virginia plantation owner, member of the House of Burgesses, bigwig in his community, he can't believe that he's being talked back to. And his attitude would be, and I said this in an earlier unit, something like, do you know who I am? Do you know who my father is back home in England? Do you know my last name? Do you recognize who I am? How dare you talk back to me? So the 28-year-old officer was as appalled and shocked that he's getting opposed, as is the 54-year-old general who can't believe this young guy is coming in and bossing him around. These kind of conflicts caused bitterness that lasted for years, and this is why we can say that partially why we can say the French and Indian War helped to cause this kind of long-term animosity. So this was, in a sense, setting the stage for future conflict between the colonists and the British, if in fact a conflict arose, and they didn't know one was going to happen at that time, but we know that it did. That being said, by far the biggest way and most important way in which the French and Indian War helped to lead to the American Revolution, and you may already know something about this, is that the French and Indian War, lasting for about 7 years against a really powerful country in France, though the British won the war, it cost a lot of money and put the British into debt in a big way. And so the British government, after the war, for the first time in its history, decided that it was going to directly tax products in the colonies and impose direct taxes for the first time. And this is what set off the furor and opposition that started a 10-year-long political crisis, followed by another war, this time between the two former allies, the British and American colonists. So the French and Indian War laid the groundwork for a future conflict. I want to make a detour here slightly for a few minutes, because at the very center of this conflict was a young guy named George Washington. 21 or 22 years old at the time, had almost no military experience, but he was from a wealthy family, had connections, and he was able to get an officer's position, low-ranking, but an officer's position in the Virginia militia. And what's happening here that leads to the French and Indian War is that the French, who had a colony in Canada already, started to move further south. The colony was in Canada, north of the Great Lakes, but they started to move to the south of the Great Lakes, and started to build forts there. If you look at the last map, you can see those blue little house-looking things are French forts that aren't too far from Pennsylvania and Virginia and British territory. So from the French perspective, this looked, for the British perspective, this looked ominous indeed, because it could have been the first part of an attempt to move actually onto British territory. The British actually considered that their territory already, but into the colonies like Pennsylvania, Virginia, and New York. Truth be told, the French colonies in the Americas, Canada, and now they're trying to move further afield, were mainly there for two purposes. One, to convert Native Americans to Christianity, and two, more importantly, to make a lot of money in the fur trade. Native Americans captured the furs. They were experts capturing the animals, beaver, pelts, and other things. And the French were taking advantage of trading that because such pelts brought huge profits back in Europe. So they weren't really building the forts in a way that was designed to attack the American colonies, which were part of the British Empire. So the British government was concerned, as well as the colonists, were concerned. But first of all, the British and their colonists couldn't have necessarily known that was the more limited reason for being there. Trade was the only reason. They were now starting to move further to the south and coming closer and closer to the American colonies. But also, since these two countries, Great Britain and France, were arguably the two most powerful in the world and were economic rivals as well as political and military rivals, the mere fact that the French fur trade is moving and spreading in North America could also be seen, and was also seen, as a threat to British interests and the relative power relationships between the two sides. Economic power is a part of power between two rivals. So because this now is a dangerous situation from the perspective of the British, they decide they need to send the French a message, which is more or less to clear out of these areas. This area you saw on the map where the French were moving into is roughly the Ohio Valley. So they sent this young officer who was not a big name. He's a huge name now, but he was a no-name then, from a wealthy family, but not a famous person yet, on this military mission with a fairly small detachment of troops. Actually went on 2 missions into the Ohio Valley in 1753 and 1754. And why did they send a guy that was almost completely inexperienced for such an important mission? It's an interesting question. I don't think we know for sure. But I think that the biggest thing to me is that George Washington was a big, young, powerful, strong guy. He was kind of like an 18th century jock. If they would have had, baseball, basketball, football in the 18th century, Washington would have been one of those guys that in high school would have lettered in all 3 sports, been sort of the star athlete of his school. He was a hunter and an expert horseman and rider, and sort of did all the macho outdoor stuff that was expected of country gentlemen, which he was of the day. So I think they probably sent him, because they didn't send him through because of his experience, because he had none, but probably mainly because they just thought, this guy is strong and young and hardy and at least live. Part of this mission took place during the winter time. If they had sent a 68-year-old guy, he may have died of pneumonia. So Washington had connections. That certainly helped him get the job. But also I think just because he was young, they thought this guy will probably at least live. So as one scholar has said, through his appointment, Washington was soon enmeshed in epochal events, meaning extremely important events, as the British and French empires began to clash over their colonial possessions. And furthermore, this forever altered the life of George Washington, an envoy, means a messenger, to the French to deliver a solemn ultimatum that they should vacate this territory claimed by England. It was a sure recipe for a military conflict, because the British knew that the French weren't going to just vacate because some young officer comes and tells them they're supposed to do so. And again, Washington was sent by the governor and lieutenant governor of Virginia with a detachment of the Virginia militia, but they were being ordered to do this by the King of England and the English Parliament. So this came all the way from London, from the British government, and this young guy, George Washington, ends up being at the center and the very beginning of what becomes a global war between kind of the two superpowers of the time. 3 decades later, as it says at the bottom of the screen, Washington reflected on the extraordinary circumstance, quote, that so young and inexperienced a person should have been employed on a negotiation with subjects of the greatest importance involved. So Washington himself, even later in life, still couldn't believe that they entrusted him with such an important mission. And in fact, he actually screwed it up. He messed up considerably, which isn't surprising since he was totally inexperienced. A few of the things that he botched or were his fault, and some of them weren't so much his fault. But if you've ever been in the military or know something about how militaries work, it oftentimes doesn't matter if something's your fault. If it happens on your watch, you get blamed for it nonetheless. And this could have killed Washington's military career, and he would have had no then political career most likely right at the beginning. So one of the things that he did to try to make up for this is when he got back to Virginia, the war now was started partly because the French didn't react well to Washington's message, and there was a couple of firefights between Washington's troops and some French troops. So the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, was underway because of Washington's mission. But when he got back, he wrote an account, a published account of his expedition, and in it he kind of fudged the results. He didn't sort of give a completely truthful view of what happened, meaning that he downplayed the mistakes that he made and the disastrous part of this, and made it look like a much more successful and glowing operation than it actually was. And I'm not saying this to criticize him. I don't blame him for it, though it's ironic that George Washington is known mythically in our history for never telling a lie. This book was filled with half-truths and at least lying by omission. But it shows to me that Washington at a young age already had some political skills, recognizing that I've got to put the proper political spin on this series of events in order to save my career. Maybe it wasn't necessary to write that, but he was taking no chances. I say maybe not necessary because he did have political connections, which also might have helped save and preserve his career to, rise further in the ranks of command and eventually into politics because of those connections. So this is kind of an aside. It doesn't have anything to do with the causes of the conflict, the Anglo-American conflict between Britain and the colonies. But remember, I'm introducing the founding fathers kind of one at a time. I did Franklin already in the last units, and now George Washington in this one. But the French and Indian War is a major sort of foundation for a future conflict, the one that comes around in 1765. Another foundation, another precursor to the conflict is something called the country court split in Great Britain. And the most famous publication that came out of this is the one you see here, a series of essays published in book form eventually, at first in newspapers, known as Cato's Letters. But this is just one publication among many like this, but it's the most famous. And these books and papers and writings got all the way across the Atlantic, and so American colonists read them. And it actually gets us back to the question that I asked at the outset today: was the whole crisis an American overreaction? And I remember answered yes. And I think this is part of it, because these received ideas, as such ideas are sometimes called, meaning not ideas that are generated in a particular time, but are brought and spread from somewhere else, in this case from Great Britain to the colonies, had a huge impact on colonial leaders and average colonial citizens' way of thinking about the unfolding conflict from 1765 on. In England, for a long time, for decades now, there had been writers and politicians who believed that there were kind of two groups in English society. At the political level, what was known as the country party and the court party. They weren't actual political parties, but they were talked about kind of as if they were. And the writers of books like Cato's Letters, essays like Cato's Letters, saw themselves as the country party and saw themselves as the good guys. And their writings were a series of jeremiads about the corruption in government by the more powerful movers and shakers, though some of the country party believers were also politicians themselves. But they were saying that the British government is controlled by a court party centered around the king and the most powerful leaders in Parliament, who are trying to take away British citizens' liberties, and they're full of corruption and fraud, in doing so. And the point here is that a large number of British citizens started to believe this. British politicians and writers. These writers believed this to be true, that their own government in their own country, right under their nose, was involved in this long-term conspiracy to take away their rights. So, does this sound familiar? Because this is exactly what the colonists and leaders like Thomas Jefferson came to believe about the English government's, doings in the colonies. So this is partly how American leaders like Jefferson came to believe that the British were involved in this long-term plot to take their rights from them, because British citizens and politicians had already been saying the same thing back in England and Great Britain about their own government as well. Quoting from a book called The Jeffersonian Persuasion by a gifted scholar named Lance Banning, he says, opposition or country party ideology identified a conspiracy of diabolical proportions, with its head at court in the king and its hands in every pocket in the kingdom. It pictured a disease that started in the government and spread inevitably to every facet of the nation's life. In America, peculiar circumstances opened enormous of influence for the same ideas. Enormous field of influence. I spelled that incorrectly. So that this idea that the government of Great Britain is conspiring against its own citizens to deprive them of their rights in England spread to the colonists. So if English citizens and politicians living there could believe that their government was involved in this diabolical plot and conspiracy against them, then of course the colonists, I think, were even more apt to believe it, and believe it they did. So this is another, I think, element that helped prepare the colonists psychologically to oppose Great Britain, because by the time that the conflict starting with the Stamp Act crisis, which we're about to get into, comes along in 1765, through these writings and other things, they're already prepared in their minds to suspect the British of the worst possible motives. Lastly, as another long-term factor helping to lay the groundwork for conflict, we have to remember that the colonial assemblies by this time, all of the colonial governments had elected legislatures and assemblies, and these were politicians and powerful individuals, usually big landowners or wealthy lawyers or businessmen who also were, leaders politically in their respective colonies. And by 1765, they were very much used to calling their own shots. The British government, or earlier the English government, had made the mistake, could be seen now as a mistake, of giving the colonists and their assemblies, their elected officials, too much power to make decisions for themselves, particularly over things like budget issues, money issues, taxation, revenue, and these kind of questions. So that when the Stamp Act hit in 1765, this was the first time in colonial history that such a direct tax had been imposed. So the colonists were totally not used to this, and this was a shock to them because they were used to being given a lot of leeway by the British government. One famous member of the British Parliament and gifted intellectual, famous intellectual as well, named Edmund Burke, actually an Irishman, coined a term that that stuck and still around, called salutary neglect. Salutary means sort of good or positive. So what he's talking about is sort of we, the British Parliament, British political leaders, have neglected the colonies, but in a way that's beneficial to both sides. So that neglect was based partially, remember, on the English government's need to try to save money, so let some of the colonies anyway be done, run, administered, founded by private companies. That already allowed the colonists in this or that colony a lot of leeway, a lot of leash and rope in independence or autonomy. Autonomy is something close to independence. So that when 1765 comes around and the Stamp Act and other such legislation that followed, taxes that followed, the colonists were enraged, partially because it had never happened before. So part of it's just the amount of time that had gone by where this had never been done. So to put it another way, if from the very beginnings of all 13 of the British colonies here, the British had started by imposing taxes and making decisions about revenue for the colonists themselves, and had done so, every year at 5-year intervals in the beginning, the colonists would have been used to it by this time. And I think the Stamp Act then would have seemed like not that big of a deal. They might not have liked it, but colonists would have been likely to say, well, we don't like this, but what we can do? It's their, they're the mother country, we're their colonists, we're their citizens, they're the government. What can we do? They have the right to do it. They've been doing it for now decades and decades. But because it had never been done before, now this is seen as a violation of rights. It's a violation of our right. You can't do that because you've never done it before. We have a long established right. It's been done this way, in my father's day, my grandfather's day, my great-grandfather's day, here in New Hampshire or wherever, and you can't change that now. This sense of rights and being deprived of rights, combined with the new sort of view that we're Americans and they're British, was a potent concoction. So we're Americans and you're violating our rights.